Did they come and put pellets down by you? Yes. Saturday, they put down. I'm not sure what if that was oh, you can look at you can look at yeah, she was. So he's got an excellent. Invasive flowers. Invasive flowers. Would we call it?
I went to
When are you having there?
Camp Show.
He does a story.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Afraid of seeing.
It real large. Yeah. I see that red.
Good evening, everybody. I'd like to call this special village board meeting Tuesday, August 30th at 7 p.m. at the Village Hall. This is a special meeting to deal with this. There are no citizen comments. So this is an informative meeting, not a discussion meeting, and please, everybody keep that in mind.
The United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Roll call.
Jensen. Here. Martin. Here. Nellis.
Here.
Paquette.
Here.
Reed.
Here.
Summers.
Here.
Yates.
Here.
All present.
Statement of public notice.
Has been posted.
Discussion and possible action on a presentation of an updated report by staff as to possible recommendations for the establishment of a reserve capacity assessment in place of existing impact fees and special assessments for water system improvements. And again, this is an information only meeting. There will be future meetings for questions and answers. Ben? Are you starting, Patrick?
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
So thank you all for coming tonight and for meeting at a special meeting here. The reason that we called for a special meeting will become a little more evident at the end of the presentation when we discuss some recommended timelines and things of that nature. But as many of you know, some time ago, we embarked on a quest to investigate an RCA or reserve capacity assessment in lieu of impact fees. The history of that I won't go into. I think we're all well aware of what precipitated that. But the board, at the board's recommendation, if you recall, we started to investigate this. We were put in touch with Trilogy, engaged to start investigating the possibility and feasibility of doing these reserve capacity assessments. There was a small working group formed of myself, Ben Wood, Christy DeMaster from Trilogy, and Hector De La Mora. And we have spent the last several months
Daddy's over there.
this process and looking at the information and made available.
That's Hector, the attorney. He's right here. That's Kevin, Patrick, Amy, Blaze's mom.
So Donna would be right.
Yeah.
So I guess I'll.
One second. What? 1 second. Cards.
All right, so the last time I was here before the village board, I believe was last October. And we have been working since then on some concepts for the RCA that we want to talk about tonight. I'd like to get started with kind of an executive summary overview to talk about what we're proposing and the kind of big picture reasons why. And then I'll get into some more of the details about the numbers and the policy considerations. Ben Wood is here to talk about the calculations of the proposed fee, and then we'll talk about the next steps that would be required should the village board want to pursue this direction further. I think Patrick covered most of what I was going to say here, but you know the history. There is $15,000 net assessments for the USDA water main connections. The current impact fees for properties connecting outside of that area are $7,923 per equivalent meter or per single family home. The direction at the time last fall when I was here back in October was to replace the impact fee with an RCA, at least for existing structures connecting to water main. I think at the time there was some consideration that maybe you keep that impact fee in place for new development. So this winter and early this spring, as I really started connecting with the village clerk, with your accountants at Baker Tilly, with Strand, and really pulling together more of the detailed information that I would need to calculate an RCA to put in front of the board, it became apparent that there may be another option that would help simplify this whole thing and also really kind of more comprehensively address all of the issues faced by property owners in the village in different situations and circumstances. So that's what we've been working on, and we've really spent the time to delve into a lot of the big questions surrounding this and what the impacts on everyone might be. So I think we're in a place now where we feel comfortable bringing this to the village board and getting your direction as to whether this is something you want to pursue. So thinking about how to kind of equitably treat everybody connecting to the village water system, there are certainly some challenges here. You've got areas of the village that are in different situations and circumstances. So water main that was installed in 1997 and 2008 was installed at a cheaper rate per foot with more properties paying in. Some of it was contributed to the village. The cost for this most recent expansion under the USDA project is quite a lot more expensive than that past water main. With the impact fee structure, you've got some properties paying at time of connection. The special assessment, you've got the 20-year installment plan, so there's some differences there. And then you've got properties that may connect to future extensions, some of which were contemplated in the impact fee study. And then hasn't been a policy developed yet for what those properties would pay. It would be another special assessment like you just did, would it be an expansion of the impact fee that hadn't been resolved. So what we've been exploring is replacing both the impact fees and the recent special assessments with a reserve capacity assessment. So taking that concept and expanding it to include all of the anticipated costs, both the recent ones, anything that wasn't collected yet through impact fees, plus future costs to extend water into the rest of the village. Offsetting that with a number of different other sources of funding that you have, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And then averaging that out over the total number of future connections. So basically charging everybody the same amount, whether they're someone that paid the impact fee last year, someone who's connected to the new water main, or somebody who would come in the future. And so when you look at total costs, you've had impact fees in place for quite a while now, so you have to true up where you're at with the impact fees. And there were some costs anticipated in that study that haven't been constructed yet, so those would be included in this. You've got the cost of the recent USDA funded project, and then the future build out, as I mentioned. The offsets to that would be the USDA grant for the current project. You've got the Waukesha County Community Fund or FORI grant funds. And then you've got some substantial project costs that were included in tax incremental finance districts for water supply and water mains. So those would all be offsets to what will go into the RCA. And we'll get into the calculations and the numbers, but we believe that that can be set at that current same amount as the impact fee, the $7,923 per equivalent meter. And just in broad terms, this would apply to anybody who connected to the 2021, or anyone who was required to connect as a result of the 2021 project. So that would include properties connecting to the older water mains, plus those who connect to the new ones. Since this is done under the special assessment statute, you can allow installment payments for everybody who pays this RCA. And so this would replace both the $15,000 assessment and the current impact fee, and also, like I said, would apply to future properties that connect. So I know one of the big questions was how does this work out that it comes down to this number and it's the same as the impact fee? And I kind of alluded to some of these things earlier. You've got kind of a lower cost per equivalent meter for some of those older mains that were installed. And then you've got some future tax incremental finance district funds that can be applied to these project costs. And in addition to that, the USDA project is actually coming in lower than was originally expected. So that frees up some money to apply to some of these future projects. And you've been collecting significant amounts of impact fees from new development, even just within the last year. So that all gets rolled in there. And so this kind of average, treat everybody the same approach allows both those connecting to the current project and those connecting to the future expansion to all share in the advantages of some of those offsets in the new development that the village has been experiencing. I don't know how much I need to get into this, but just as I was looking through the past history of what's been done, there's some interesting things that kind of jumped out at me. So back in '97, you had that limited amount of water main installed, no new customers, no charges. In 2008, you installed more water main. A lot of that was actually contributed by Whispering Ridge. At that time, there's 2 impact fee zones set up, one to pay for wells, storage, things like that were system-wide benefits, and another one to pay for that local 8-inch equivalent water main. There were some water mains that were in the kind of main bid for the 2008 project, and then there were some other pieces that were bid alternates. They were not included in that impact fee originally in 2008. So when Strand updated that in 2018, they added in those costs and created a 3rd impact fee zone. Then in 2019, you had the extension to Landon Elementary School. There were some properties that connected at that time and paid impact fees. And then in 2020, Strand updated that impact fee study to include those 2019 costs and kind of combine the zones 2 and 3 into one impact fee zone. So the implication of that in looking at this is that when the 2020 impact fee study came out, at that time, the cost for anybody connecting to mains that had been installed up to that point were then averaged. So instead of having someone pay a different fee, whether they connected to a 1997 piece of main or a 2008 main that was connected under the main contract, or 2008 main that's constructed under the bid alternate, anyone connecting to a 2020 or earlier main paid the same amount. And then in 2021, of course, the village levied special assessments for the new project that were really specific to that project area. So that puts you today where you have, just going down the side here, the properties connecting to those pre-2020 mains under current policies would pay an impact fee for system-wide facilities of $13.67, plus an impact fee of $65.56 for those abutting 8-inch water mains that they're actually connecting to, or a total of $79.23. If you're in the USDA project area connecting to those mains under current policy, you pay the $13.67 for wells, reservoirs, and pumping stations, plus a $15,000 net assessment, for a total of $16,367. And again, under current policy, if you do send water main out in the future, what's on the books today is that those properties would pay the $13.67 zone 1 impact fee, and the cost of the main running past their property is yet to be determined what they would pay for that. Yes.
So if we can maybe just stop there for a minute, and as you can see, as we started, anytime we started to try to evaluate these things with all these different zones and for the impact fees, the special assessments, it was a very tangled web and very convoluted and difficult to track. And so we started to look at this RCA thing and think about, well, can we apply this more broadly? And then we thought, well, let's take it a step further. And if we're going to really simplify this, how can we make this all inclusive for the entire village so that everyone can benefit from this? And we know right up front, now going forward, what this is going to cost the homeowner, so that people in Landon Village Hills or along Good Hope Road aren't just sitting out there wondering what it's going to cost them someday to get water. Plus, they get to then, by doing this way, they get some of the benefit of all of the things that have happened to date so far with grant funding and things like that. So I don't know if you want to pause for, does anybody have any questions at this point on what we've covered so far, or anything that we want to go over further, or should Christine just keep plowing ahead here?
I guess I do have two things. Spoke about the school fees that were charged. Are those still existing on the numbers for the current charges? Because those, if they were paid by the school district, shouldn't be being charged again, which they were in the special assessments. And then the old municipal debt from 2008 and 1996 should still be gone from those also, because it's after the 10-year
Extension.
allotment of time.
Statute of limitations.
Yeah, I can address those with a little bit further on in the presentation, certainly.
All right.
Okay, so, yeah, like I said earlier, we did reach out to the folks at USDA and just to make sure this wouldn't have a negative impact on the village's USDA loan if you were to go this route. So their take on this was that you can use any and all revenues from the village water utility to make payments on that loan and to provide that coverage. And so they really just deferred this question of, is it going to be okay if you reduce the assessments or do something different with those? They referred us to the village's bond council. So then we reached out to Quarles and Brady to talk about that, inquire about that issue. And they're, again, confirmed that you can use all of the village's water utility revenues towards that service and towards debt coverage, which so you're required to have net revenues that are equal to 110% of your debt service each year. So that can include any combination of revenues, including special assessments. And they don't, your bond covenants that you agreed to when you did that loan did not specify how much you have to charge for special assessments. So that gave us some comfort with that aspect of things. And then I reached out to the village accountant Baker Tilly to get more detail from them regarding the water utilities revenues, expenses, and other debt service, because you have some other existing outstanding debt service. So yeah, I feel like I should get into the numbers a little bit, and certainly if you have questions, please stop me at this point. So this is what the Baker Tilly submitted with the village's recent application for a water rate increase. So they are saying based on current rates, the water utility has net operating revenues of a little over 300,000. The proposed rate increase is another $90,000 of revenues for that. And then we estimated what the installment payments would be on these reserve capacity assessments at the proposed 7923. So we assumed that, and this is similar assumptions to what we used previously with this, that there would be a 20-year installment payment allowed, that 15% of properties would choose to prepay in full, and the other 85% would be on an installment plan. We assumed that interest rate would be 2.25%, which was what was established for these existing special assessments. So those are all the major assumptions there. And then the water utilities estimated operation, maintenance expenses, and taxes leave you with net projected earnings of 349,000. And then your existing debt service right now is 317,000 per year with the USDA loan. So that does provide you with adequate coverage for that. And the other thing I wanted to note here is that there are the 2017 bonds will be paid off in 2027, and then there was a little bit of debt that was issued in 2020 that'll be done in 2030. So once those drop off, this coverage calculation would look better than what I'm showing here. I did prepare a 40-year projection on that, given kind of current conditions and to see what that looks like, and provided that to Baker Tilly as well as to others. And but that's too many numbers to put on the screen at this point in time. So if you decide to go on this route, there's just kind of some policy considerations that I want to put out there for you to start thinking about. One is with the impact fees, and the idea here is that those would be repealed once you implement this RCA. And then we need to look at what's been spent and what's been collected with those impact fees, and I'll get into that in a moment. There are some revenues that have already been collected that can be applied towards the debt service on those 2017 bonds that are still being paid off. And I'll get into the details of that momentarily. With the RCAs, the idea that we've been talking about, but again, this is a policy decision, is that those would be deferred until a property connects. And that would, so if you've got undeveloped vacant land, they would not pay the RCA right now. That would not trigger until they've got a structure on there. So everybody would pay when they've got a structure that's actually connecting to the main. We're proposing, and then I did that previous slide show the numbers with the 20-year installments. So, you know, we're comfortable that you could still allow the 20-year installment payments on those. And I also, you know, feel comfortable that you could allow the 2.25% interest rate on those that was already established. Under statutes, you do have the option to increase that. You could go as high as 3.75%. So if there's any interest in looking at that, we could look at that. And we've also, we're discussing that you could still allow or require developers who are benefiting from TIF funds or planned unit development in the context of their developer agreement, make them pay those fees upon connection rather than allowing the 20-year installment for those. So then there's a question of what happens with those properties that have already paid their USDA assessment or made an installment payment last year. Since the fees would be deferred until there's a structure connecting, that would mean that vacant lots would have to be refunded what they paid. People who pay their assessment off in full would have to be refunded the difference between that and the 7,900. And then you have people that made a first installment payment last year, and so they have to be credited that amount over and above what it would have been with the 7,900 would be credited against their future installment payments. And then there's just kind of some more longer term future considerations, you know, and I just want to note that costs for future projects are estimated. And, you know, construction costs are probably likely to go up before those projects actually are constructed. And this is also based on, I think we have a pretty solid idea of how many future equivalent meter connections you're likely to have, because it's been looked at in detail. And a lot of them are already, you know, developed lots of homes on them, so that's pretty straightforward. But to some extent, those numbers are an estimate, right? So a couple of recommendations to think about with regards to managing this going forward. One suggestion is to increase the amount of the fee per RCA as long as it's deferred for a particular property. So if it's $7,923 now, apply an inflationary factor to that each year. So if somebody connects 5 years or 10 years from now, that they would be paying a higher fee, but we try to keep it kind of current in terms of today's dollars. So that would help offset future increases in construction costs and also keep some kind of parity between somebody who pays it this year versus somebody who pays it down the road. And I got a couple ideas on there, either to adjust it by a construction cost index, which would mean that the inflationary factor would be different from one year to the next, but it would track hopefully closely with what's going on with your construction costs. The other option is to put a fixed percentage increase in there, you know, maybe 5% per year. You know, the benefit of that is that everybody, they know upfront what they're going to be looking at for a fee down the road. And the other thing I would say, and other communities that have these types of fees do periodically review and adjust those RCAs to account for actual or updated estimates of construction costs and so on, just to make sure that you're keeping it current and collecting them. And then another best practice with something like this is to adopt an ordinance describing your RCA policies, just because it's a longer term collection as opposed to a very limited one-time project area. So it's good to have those things on the books and everybody's aware of them. All right, so I think I can get back to your questions now. I took a look at what kind of where everything is at with the impact fees, because yeah, we don't want to include, well, two things, I guess. One is that under impact fee law, if you collect impact fees for something, you have to spend it on the projects that you collected it for. So we want to make sure that you're doing that. And then I guess the other issue is if there's anything in here that can appropriately be included in the new RCA. So to date, you've collected about almost 2.9 million of impact fees, and that's really accelerated in the last couple of years. Costs that you've actually spent and have been expended to date include debt service on the bonds that were originally issued in 2007. So that's about 1.2 million. Those are refunded and replaced in 2017, and through this year, you've paid about 613,000 on those. The 2019 water main extension, that was incorporated into the impact fee study in 2020. So that 88,000 there is just the portion that wasn't paid for by the school. So that's what that is. And then you've got some impact fee share of the land and estate as well. And that includes some things that were listed in the 282,000 that was listed in the USDA loan agreement, as well as the acquisition value of the land and estate as well. So to date, you've collected about 451,000 more more than what's been spent, but you have some future commitments also. So the future debt service on those 2017 bonds is about 616,000. So net position on this is you're pretty close to having collected the amount that you spent. You'll maybe a little bit less than that. So what that 164,000 there that you're kind of short on impact fees. My thought on that was that's less than what the impact fee share of the land and estate as well would be. So I think it'd be appropriate to roll that into the reserve capacity assessment. Okay, with that, I will turn it over to Ben to talk about the details of the calculations.
Sure. So if you can remember that kind of math equation that was put up on the screen before, calculating the reserve capacity assessment becomes like a very straightforward calculation. One of the requirements, of course, is that you have to, with any special assessment, you have to treat similarly situated properties similarly. The village board has made the decision in the past to do that by doing equivalent meters as opposed to length of frontage, area of parcel. We've been through that before. So this calculation is really just going to be total project costs minus these offsets is a net cost, and you divide that by the total number of equivalent meters that have yet to connect, and that results in the RCA fee on a per equivalent meter basis. So this slide shows a map of the water system. The darkest color water main here is all the water main that was in the ground prior to or not related to, let that go by, these 2021 water main policy decisions on the USDA project. So all the water main, with, I guess I should say with the exception of the Main Street main. All the water main in the yellow color was part of the 2021 USDA project, and all the water main in green, which includes, well, to go in a linear fashion, Good Hope Road west of Main Street, Dudevik Drive, Town Line Road from where the USDA project stopped here, all the way up to the Land Village Hills neighborhood, and within that, a little bit of water main to loop the parcel that is intended for the future water tower and the future well. Includes the cost of those. It also includes the cost of the water main that it would take to get to the properties on the northern border of the village. We also factored in, we don't know exactly, the studies haven't been done, the engineering hasn't been done, but there's potential to have a small booster station for the Land and Village Hills neighborhood, at least the one that's on the higher street here. Forgive me, the name is escaping me. But that street's kind of the highest ground in the village, and they might need a small booster station. So with that, we take all of the water main improvements from the 2021 USDA projects, which is just under $7.5 million. The cost of the future water main extensions, all of the green areas I just showed on the previous map, plus the cost of future supply and source improvements, that would be a third well, a water tower, and potentially a small booster station. All those costs together come out to just short of $20 million. But again, keep in mind that this includes the 2021 project. So if you took out the $7.5 million already spent, that's about $12.5 million to go to build out the system. So total offsets, 3.493 million in USDA grant funds that the village secured. The village had to make a contribution of $143,000 toward that project per the USDA letter of conditions. And then just adopted last week was the TID1 and TID2 project plan that includes $8.6 million of future water infrastructure costs. And that includes approximately 90% of the cost of a new well, 90% of the cost of a water tower, and a large share of the cost of additional water main extensions. And those additional water main extensions were able to be included because the village amended the area of the boundary of those TIF districts. So total offsets then come out to about 12.25 million. So to figure out the number of connections for which you kind of divide all of the dollars by to get the per RCA fee or per equivalent meter fee, we take a look at future developments in the village. So we've broken this up into 13 different little sub areas in the village so that we can describe each of those areas and how many equivalent meters we expect for each of those. If this looks vaguely familiar, this is the same approach that was in the 2020 impact fee. And then this table, I won't get into it, but just know that for each of those 13 areas, there's a little bit of commentary that describes the growth that's expected, how various properties were treated, how many equivalent meters are due to future buildings, how many are related to existing structures, And you come out with a total projection of 741 total equivalent meters. Now I want to point out, for example, area 11 here that has 159. This is the northeastern area of the village that's up here. Okay, so there's a lot of vacant land. There's the cemetery, the church. There's a couple of other buildings around here. It includes, this is the gross parcel for which TID 1 was amended for future senior living, elderly housing, etc. That's kind of what Christy was alluding at. Obviously, 150 is the biggest single category in this thing, and we're making certain assumptions about development occurring up there at a rate of 2.5 units per acre. There's 9 existing structures, etc. So what this contemplates is that these equivalent meters, all this, these connections would happen. I tried to align it by when the TIDs would expire, since a lot of the funding of future infrastructure aligns with the use of TID funds. 2045 is more or less when the TID funds have to be spent by. So we aligned the growth projection with that same year. So from there, go ahead,
Before you
Hector.
go on, could you go back?
Sure.
Could you explain in layman's terms what an equivalent meter is?
Certainly. Thank you for bringing that up. So this was policy made by the village board in 2020 that applied both to the existing special assessments and the impact fees that are in place now. And before 2020, the village relied on projecting growth in terms of residential equivalent connections. And there was a equation prescribed in the village ordinances that basically said, okay, when a new customer connects to the water utility, you assume based on a chart how much water they would use relative to the average residence in the village. And for single family housing, that was very easy, but for commercial or industrial properties or multifamily properties, that became really challenging because the provisions in the ordinance said, well, you make an assumption, and then after the first 12 months, you calculate what their water use actually was, divided by the average water use of a single family residence, and then you charge them again if you were underestimating, or you refund them if you were overestimating. And it was just contemplated that that was going to be an administrative nightmare to try to handle that. So the village went to a practice of equivalent meters. That was one of the things that was scrutinized over the course of the past year that Christie addressed in previous reports as common practice for other utilities as well. And it basically says this: the amount of water that an individual property can use is by and large limited by the size of their water meter. Landon's PSC utility formation documents treat a 3/4 inch meter and a 5/8 meter as the same, and the most common meter that a single family residence uses. From there, if someone wants to use more water, they will need to have a larger water meter. And therefore you would charge them based on a ratio of how much water can go through that large meter compared to the normal size meter. So in this case, by and large, it treats all but maybe 2 properties as just a single equivalent meter. The 2 exceptions being Landon Estates, which has a 3-inch meter, which counts as 20 equivalent meters. So they can withdraw water at 20 times the rate as a normal household. The only other property in here that we contemplated being more than 1 equivalent meter would possibly be Calvary Baptist Church, which has a school. Also, we have no idea what size meter they're going to use, but I think we assumed it would be a 2-inch meter, which I forget at the moment is either 2 or 3 equivalent meter connections. So to rehash this calculation with actual numbers, the RCA fee is the total project cost minus the total project offsets divided by the number of equivalent meters. You do that math and it comes out in a very, reasonable, straightforward calculation, comes out as $10,406. Waukesha County Community Foundation's Corey Fund would be assumed to make a contribution on behalf of the individual properties. This was done as part of the 2021 special assessments that were levied. So it's a comparable amount here that we're talking about would be kind of put in to the benefit of each of those 741 equivalent meter connections. And in crediting that right out of the gate, every property, whether it's someone that connected last year, this year, or will connect in 10 years, is realizing some immediate reduction of that right out of the gate. And by taking off that last deduction, the final anticipated reserve capacity assessment fee is $7,923 per equivalent meter. Christine.
So I just want to walk through kind of the next steps and a little bit of a anticipated schedule to, should you want to move forward with this. So we're contemplating this as an amendment of the special assessment to expand the area and expand the project costs that are included. So under the special assessment statute, we'd have to direct staff to prepare a report that meets all the requirements of the special assessment statute to move forward with those RCAs. You'd also have to have an ordinance repealing the impact fees, and the idea is that that would be done at the same time as you approve any RCAs. And then the next step for the RCAs would be to adopt a preliminary resolution declaring your intent to do so, to schedule a public hearing, mail and publish notice of that public hearing, and then finally hold a public hearing on those proposed RCAs. And then after that point, you could adopt the final resolution establishing the RCAs. And then again, as I recommended, best practice to also codify those into the village ordinances. So in looking at this, we were trying to put together a schedule that would allow this to take all that to take place in time so that property owners who did not want to pay their RCAs in full could have that installment payment on the tax roll for this year. So what we're anticipating is if you direct us to move forward with preparing the necessary reports and ordinances and things, that preliminary resolution could potentially take place at the regular September meeting. And then there would be an ad submitted to the paper. We would be working on preparing the final RCA report. Then there'd be a class 1 notice that would be required, and you can hold a public hearing anytime between 10 days and 40 days after that notice is sent out. So the latest date, if you wanted to hold a public hearing at your regular October meeting, you could send out that notice either the 21st or the 28th of September. And then following that, another village board meeting to actually act on that final resolution. And then that would give some time, a couple of weeks for property owners to pay their RCA if they chose to do so. And then those who did not would have an installment payment placed on the tax bills. So that's kind of the timeline for how that could proceed if you wanted to move forward.
All right, thank you, Christy and Ben. Did we have any other questions, concerns, comments at this point from the board here? Kelly, did you feel that your questions were addressed there?
So I don't know if this is for Christie or Ben Patrick. Chime in. This being tied to the USDA, is that going to affect anybody that wants to keep their existing well?
No.
And then has anybody had an approved permit to keep their well?
I know we have a handful that are in process. I don't know if any of those moved through to completion.
About 7 are completed, and there are more in process.
And talking about increasing the amount of the RCA's per year, is that for new projects that will be forthcoming? Or is will that impact anybody that's on the RCA?
No, so the people that would be assessed or that have already connected that this would apply to today, that amount is set, the interest rate is set. What we have to do is come up with a methodology or a mechanism to adjust the RCA on an annual basis, similar to the impact fees. The impact fees schedule that we had a 3% annual increase built into it to try to adjust for future costs of construction and financing and things of that nature. Obviously, right now, we're dealing with some very interesting times in terms of that. So, I mean, that could very well be our biggest challenge, is deciding how we do that. And that's why, in our discussions, I suggested, the possibility of the construction cost index, at least then that's tracking with kind of a level playing field metric, if you will. But again, that's a policy decision if we want to tie it to something like that, or if we want to set a set percentage. It would also be strongly recommended that we reevaluate this on a regular basis, perhaps every 36 months or so, just to revisit it, rerun the calcs, make sure that everything's in line, and make any necessary changes going forward. Some of these, like the Colley Farm, the proposed development there, I mean, we're several years out before that's going to come to fruition. So we want to make sure that we're keeping up with this and making sure that it's going to continue to be fair to the property owner, but done in such a way that the village can cover the associated costs.
Yeah, I mean, if this actually all works out the way that it's laid out here, I mean, that's half. So it's like 4, which is great.
I think there's a little bit of something in there for everybody.
Is Trilogy available and I renegotiate my mortgage?
Sorry.
That's all I have. Thank you.
I would just like to point out a little bit that had things been done this fairly from, if it all works out, this fairly from the start, there wouldn't have been a lot of issues. A lot of people wouldn't have lost their wells already.
Yep.
So just so that's out there.
If I could make a comment about that. In our working sessions, I reflected on the fact that if we knew then what we now know, we would have made the decision. But the reality is we didn't. We proceeded with different arrangements because, number one, the big setback that the village experienced was being turned down for a loan or a village-wide expansion. And the window of opportunity opened. We got an interest rate which is just unbelievable. At the same time, the village was able to come to grips with the fact that the quarries were willing to make a significant contribution to the village in exchange for not having to abide by the well guarantee. And at the same time, we had the benefit of a project of installation that actually was completed by and large. There are a few odds and ends, but it was completed in a timely fashion. And the bids came in, realizing for us a savings we never envisioned. Now, the condition that the USDA has is that if we don't use that money, the savings, it goes back. And what this evaluation contemplates is that it will be used as a credit towards the future expansion of the water system to the entire village. So yes, you are right. If we knew then what we now know, we would have avoided a lot of conflict, but we didn't. So the village is in a very, very positive position right now because it has something that when the first installment occurred, never contemplated could be achieved on the scale that it's available at the present time.
So, one other thing that I handed out, a couple of pages here, in some discussions with Ben, we thought it, you know, one of the areas that I know that we haven't always been successful in is communicating, with folks. At Ben's recommendation and his assistance, we put together this proposed mailer that we would anticipate, assuming that a decision is made tonight to move forward in this direction and continue formalizing some of this stuff. This would be a mailer that we would recommend sending out village-wide in the coming days, just to get it out there. It occurred to me that I don't believe we have this presentation on the website yet either, so we should probably get that put up there. Just so people are aware of what's happening, what's being proposed, and what might change. And again, I'll reiterate, might change. There's obviously a lot of steps to go through still after this. So. But with that being said, I would make a motion to instruct our consultants to move forward with the steps laid out here and to continue the process and start formalizing some of these things and getting the details nailed down so that the board can make a decision at a later date.
I'll second.
We have a motion and second. Do we have any more discussion? Any more comments, Ben?
Patrick, we had contemplated earlier today if the board had any initial reactions on
Yeah.
the interest rate when someone is levied the 79.23. It's currently at 2.25% interest because that's what the USDA financing is, which, as Hector says, very, very low. We won't see that again, most likely. So, you know, for everyone moving forward, you know, if someone doesn't connect, if the village installs more water main 10 years from now, and someone connects then, we don't know what the interest rates will be then on that financing. And I think the intent is that when you actually levy someone, the interest rate is more or less tied to the interest rate on the village's debt for that same project.
You can add up to 2% for an administrative fee.
Right now in the USDA project, on that note, only 0.3% was added as an administrative fee. As Christie said, if you have an interest in revisiting that, that can be reinterested. Some affirmation or redirection on whether or not 20-year installments are appropriate. Some direction or reaction to the concept of deferred assessments. A little bit more background on that issue specifically is if you don't defer assessment, which was the case for the USDA project, all vacant land you have to assume is one equivalent meter. Well, obviously in here, the Cawley farm, as Patrick used as an example, their reclamation plan is that they would have 120 units. So right now it's 2 parcels. So if you did not defer assessments and you levy everyone right now, you would only get 2 fees out of them. You'd rather defer it and wait until you get 120 fees out of them, for example. So what that means for approximately 8 properties on the 2021 assessment is that they would get refunded and they wouldn't pay it until there's a structure there that connects to plumbing. Some affirmation on the schedule is another thing that we wanted. You know, the 2021 assessments are active with an annual payment of $939.43 or 63 cents. So those bills get prepared this November, and the approach here, while it's fast, is to try to have those people realize the savings on the very next bill that they would get. I think those were all the issues around the assumptions that we've made, and if you all could just give some direction or affirmation of those, that would be helpful as we prepare the reports.
So maybe you can, just to simplify it for us, for those of us that can't remember all of that. Maybe you can just go through each one of those one by one, and we can just kind of weigh in as a group and check them off the list. So,
Okay, if we, just since we can all look at this at the same time, and I'll point at this. For reserve capacity assessments, defer them until the property connects.
I'm in favor.
Okay. 20-year installments as opposed to last go around, we looked at 5-year, 10-year, 15-year options.
I'm good with 20.
Yeah. We got 20 now.
Yep.
Endless interest rate.
Okay,
Right.
yeah, all right, so we'll get in,
Well, if you go back to the previous one, that we're talking about the interest rate on the installments.
okay.
Yeah.
So right now, the interest rate is tied to the village's interest rate. I guess, what's
So you
the
could,
ask?
you could, so it's 2.25% right now, which is a very, very minimal administrative fee on top of the actual interest rate for the USDA loan. So you could increase that up to 2 percentage points above that current interest rate, so up to 3.75%. So
Brenda, do you recall, I thought when we actually closed on that loan, the interest rate came in lower than we were anticipating one rate, but it actually came in a little bit lower.
A little bit lower, but I don't recall this. I believe it was 1.87 initially, and then it was,
Then it ended up being 1.75 or something like that.
yes.
Okay, so we're at about a half a point then, if that's, assuming that's
There you go.
correct.
Yep.
So, I mean, it seems reasonable to me. Half a point? Yeah, okay.
Okay, and I think the intent for that is to handle administrative costs, like Brenda preparing the tax rolls every year,
Reporting and things of that. nature.
right? Baker Tilly doing audits, Christie updating it every 36 months.
Right. But the idea would be that these current ones, anybody that was getting reassessed now would stay at that 2.25%, right? Which is the
That's the assumption.
half a point anyway.
So the new rate would be, or anybody not assessed currently would be how much, just for clarification.
I'm contemplating, so if we get 5 years down the road or 10 years down the road and you do another water main extension project, that would have to be reevaluated, what interest rate you would charge on those installment payments at that time, if the interest rate is presumably higher at that point in time. So yes, we'd have to reevaluate that at that point.
My assumption would be that, I mean, there's an administrative cost is an administrative cost. I don't see us ever really. I wouldn't see us ever extending beyond like the half a point, but.
Also covers the cost.
Right, that's all we're trying to do. So,
So that would be 2.75.
2.25 is what it was.
2.25 for folks now.
Okay.
In the future, we don't know. It's gonna be a half a point above whatever we borrow at.
Because the USDA was 1.8.
I believe so.
What we could do, hearing that, you know, the intent is kind of twofold. First, tie it to the interest rate of the debt, and two, make sure that whatever the increase is covers your cost.
Right.
We could at least in this case say, okay, this is how much interest rate is coming in. And size it up to, you know, be able to say, do we think this covers the admin costs or not? Just bring that forth at a future meeting as a point of reference.
Right.
Is that something you can bring up to us in our next meeting?
I think that's, yeah, that we could do that, and address that with the report as well.
I'm just checking off my list here. Bear with me a second. Okay, so the next issue would be increase the amount of the RCA fee per year for deferred RCAs. This was already in place for the impact fee schedule, and it actually went up about 4% per year. So the question here is, given that future RCAs will be collected to pay for future construction costs, all of this analysis right now is in like present year dollars. It doesn't take into an account an inflationary factor and a schedule for when Village would do all these projects. So the interest rate on the schedule year over year would be intended to cover increase in actual costs.
Absolutely. I think that's the way we gotta go.
Yeah.
We can't
It-
not
it-
do it.
Yeah, and it wouldn't affect anybody who's now
Correct,
just
correct.
connected.
It's all
and paying
future
some- right,
focus.
only
Correct.
future connections. Yeah.
So the question is, how would it be easier to pick an interest rate? Or would it be more appropriate to do, check it against the construction cost index?
I would probably go that route. I think that's the most fair way to do it.
I recently have been negotiating other communities' garbage contracts. And typically those are 5-year ventures. And with the current economic climate, the most that we could agree on was producer indexes, which are geared to that particular industry. And this is really an area where we can focus in on a particular sector of the economy as opposed to CPI, which takes into consideration food prices and things that may not have a direct bearing on the cost. So I think it would be prudent for the village to start off with an index key to the construction industry.
Yeah, and I think that one of the other things that we probably ought to try to nail down is when and how often we're going to adjust those. So I think, given today's climate, I'd be inclined to, adjust this at least twice a year. Would be my thought. So maybe on the first of the year and, July 1st, you go out and grab the index number and you adjust it. That's, I think, enough to keep it semi-current without getting overly burdensome from an administrative standpoint. And then, I guess the question I would have, Christie, is then how do we do that? Do we do that as a factor on what it is like today or when we decide this?
Yeah, typically you'll say, okay, so the fee is $79.23 right now, and at whatever date you establish that you're gonna, increase it. You look at usually it's a 12-month window, but you could do 6 months as well and say, what was the ratio of the current construction on cost index to what it was 6 months ago or a year ago. And if it's a factor of 1.06, you take the fee that's in place right now and you multiply it by 1.06, and then.
So at what point would we peg that CPI number going forward into the future for future calculations?
Oh, like what would be your starting date?
Yes.
That's a good question because, you know, we've been working on this for a few months, so there's not really like, it's hard to say
Right.
what's the exact vintage of the estimated cost that we're working with. So I think that's.
Again, I have to go back to this page before and the revenues that have already been collected being held to pay off the 2008 improvements. That's gonna play into all of these numbers. That's still old debt that is being, that wasn't explained away.
The 2008 debt was refinanced in 2017.
So you did,
Yeah,
just
none of
rolled
that
it
is
over and
included. None of
still
that is
tacked
included
it
in the RCA calculations.
Right. No,
Because
it's
we're
not
assuming
in
that the impact fees that have already been collected would pay that off.
I think to get back to your question, January 1 and July 1 seems reasonable. So if you said, for example, that could play out with 7923 is associated with July 1, 2022. And you look at, you would just say anyone for the rest of this year, that's what it would be. On January 1, you would take that index ratio and say, what are construction costs on January 1 compared to July 1 of the previous year?
So I think what I'm trying to avoid is compounding those increases. So I think what I'm saying or suggesting is a concept of looking at like the construction price index today, right? Like right now, this second on your phone.
Yep.
Here's what it is now. Any increases get factored against that number. That becomes your baseline
Yeah,
into
that's good.
perpetuity.
And the 7923 is your baseline.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
then those two are tied forever. And then
Right.
the increase in the index is the factor that you increase the 7923 by.
Yep.
And it just gets incrementally adjusted each time as opposed to getting compounded each time.
That's a little different than I normally write it into ordinances, but I do like that also because then if you've got fluctuations where it goes down a little bit between January and July 1 year, you're not reducing the fee because it's still presumably higher than it was 2 years ago or whatever. The starting point, so.
I don't know, maybe, I don't do this for a living, so maybe it's the same net result, but
Well, I think the direction that we as staff need is that construction cost index is what the board would like us to research.
did we miss any of the other items that we wanted some clarification? on?
Schedule.
Yeah, the last one is schedule. And keep in mind that this is not just the RCA and the associated hearing and everything, but it's doing whatever repeal and replace is required for the previous special assessment, historic impact fees, etc.
Is anybody uncomfortable with this schedule?
No, I think it's good schedule. If we can get it done before the assessments go out,
Exactly,
then those credits can go out to the people on the next tax bill, you
right.
know, when it comes in December. So,
And I'll also note, I don't believe that October 11th is a regular meeting. That would be on a special night. Yeah, the October 10th is a Monday. That would be the regular meeting. So the 11th would be having the hearing on the day following.
we'll be here. We'll make it happen.
Hector, you had something? else?
In view of the fact that the village is trying to get information out about this, and the board was just introduced to where we are, I think it would make sense to devote a special meeting, if you will, on the 11th as opposed to the regular board meeting, to give everyone the opportunity to ask questions and be heard.
Does anybody, you may not have had a chance to read through these yet, but are you in favor of something like this going out as soon as is reasonable? With no substantial changes? I mean, we may. I've got a spelling error to correct and.
Put the date of the public hearing.
Yeah, we could put the anticipated public hearing date on there, just so people are aware, and get those posted on the web as well. Okay, well, that clears up that one for me then too.
We have any more discussion, any more comments? We have a motion and second. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carried. Item 6, discussion and possible action to approve crushing permit for Lemke Stone at 21385 West Good Hope Road, Lannon, Wisconsin, 53046, regarding stone crushing for Kelly's Greenscapes.
Board committee met yesterday with Kelly's, and they just want to crush some stone at Lemke. Board committee recommended that it be approved for 45 days.
We have any more discussion?
I'll make a motion, we approve the crushing permit on Stone and Kelly's Greenscapes for 45 days.
We have a motion and second. Do we have any more discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carried.
Make a motion to adjourn.
Second.
Motion and second. Do we have any more discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carried. Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight.
Yeah.
It still seems like a lot of fun times we have in the first place, because the way it all played out.